The voice sounded exactly like Shireen's, but Shireen was back at camp. It was supposed to be a team-building retreat. 5 colleagues from a Kuala Lumpur marketing firm decided to conquer Gunung Liang, a challenging but popular trail in Selangor. Among them was Amir, a skeptical city-born Malay who believed most ghost stories were rural myths to scare children. Their guide, a seasoned Orang Asli Jakun named Pak Mayil, gave them a single stern rule before they entered the forest. If you hear someone calling your name, especially if it sounds like one of us, you do not answer. You do not turn. You keep walking. The first day was grueling but successful. By the second day, as they neared the densest part of the trail, the group became strung out. Amir, feeling fit, had pushed ahead of the others. He stopped by a still, murky stream to wait, the silence of the jungle pressing in on him. It was then he heard it. A familiar voice, strained and panicked, echoed from the thicket behind him. "Amir! Amir! Talong! I fell! I think I broke my leg!" It was the voice of his colleague, Shireen. Every instinct told him to turn back, to crash through the bushes and help her. He took a step, his mouth opening to shout back, but then Pak Mayil's words slammed into his mind like a physical force. "You do not answer." His blood ran cold. The voice was Shireen's, but the intonation was wrong. It was too flat, too perfectly projected, lacking the raw gasp of someone truly in pain. It was a mimicry. Terrified, he forced his legs to move forward, away from the sound. The calls continued, growing more desperate, more angry. "Amir! Amir, why are you leaving me? Help me, you coward!" He clamped his hands over his ears and walked, reciting Ayat Kursi under his breath until the sound faded into the rustle of leaves. He reached the summit campsite hours later, pale and shaking. The rest of the group, including Shireen, arrived an hour after him, unharmed and confused by his state. Shireen swore she had been with the group the entire time. That night, Pak Mayil approached Amir. He said nothing, just placed a small, crude iron nail wrapped in yellowed cloth into Amir's palm. He pointed to Amir's backpack, which he had left propped against a tree when he'd stopped by the stream. Amir understood. While he had been focused on the false voice, something, a polong, a familiar spirit of a dukun, had been sent to mark him. It hadn't just called his name, it had touched his bag. For the rest of the trek, Amir carried the iron nail. He felt a constant, uneasy prickle on the back of his neck, the feeling of being watched with a patient, possessive hunger that followed him all the way back to the city, lingering in the corners of his apartment for weeks after. They cut down a sacred tree in the middle of a silent valley, and something small started feeding on them at night. Every night, they felt it sitting on their chest. This story comes from an old logger in Pahang, a man named Ahwat who worked the ancient forests for over 30 years. He had one rule for his crew: never cut down the suntai tree. It was considered a resting place for spirits, a sacred tree that the Orang Asli respected. A new crew, hungry for profit and dismissive of old superstitions, ignored him. They felled the massive suntai tree deep in a secluded valley, a place known locally as the Valley of the Echoes, because sounds seemed to be swallowed rather than reflected. The logging was swift, the wood valuable, but the trouble began immediately. Tools started going missing: chainsaws, axes, even personal items like wallets and watches. They'd find them later, hidden in impossible places, a heavy chainsaw balanced on a high branch, a wallet buried deep in a pile of sawdust. Then the food started to disappear. not in large quantities, but nibbles taken out of packed rice, sweets licked clean of their sugar, a single egg stolen from a ration pack. Men began to complain of a weight on their chests at night, a feeling of being pinned down, unable to move or cry out. They'd wake with tiny, unexplained scratches on their arms and legs, 3 small parallel lines. Ahwat knew the signs. A toyol, a mischievous and greedy familiar spirit, had been disturbed, but this one felt different, meaner. The foreman, a skeptic named Mr. Tan, dismissed the complaints until he was the last one in the camp one evening, tallying the day's harvest. He heard it then, a faint childish giggle from the stack of newly cut timber. He grabbed his flashlight and walked towards the sound. As he rounded the stack, he saw a small gray-skinned figure, no bigger than a toddler, with large, luminous eyes. It was crouched on a log, greedily stuffing raw wood resin into its mouth. When the light hit it, the toyol didn't chew, its head swiveling towards Mr. Tan, and smiled. Its teeth were needle-thin. Mr. Tan ran. The toyol didn't chase, but its giggle echoed through the valley, bouncing from tree to tree, multiplying until it sounded like a dozen children laughing. The next morning, Mr. Tan's prized SUV wouldn't start. Every vehicle's fuel lines had been chewed through with unnerving precision. Mr. Tan finally agreed to consult a local bomo. The bomo visited the valley, his face grim. He explained that felling the suntai hadn't just disturbed a toyol, they had cut down its home, the anchor that tied it to the human who had created it. The spirit was now wild, unbound, and voraciously hungry. It was no longer just stealing food, it was feeding on their life force, their energy, their luck, their health, through the scratches and the sleep paralysis. The bomo performed a complex pumajan, a ritual of appeasement at the stump of the suntai, leaving offerings of eggs, glutinous rice, and a small child's shirt. He told Ahwat they must leave the valley immediately and never return. They did. The logging operation moved to a different section of the forest, but the men who had worked in the valley were never the same. They were perpetually tired, their luck soured. Mr. Tan's business went bankrupt within a year. Ahwat retired soon after, refusing to speak of the valley. He only said that some forests don't just grow trees, they guard secrets, and when you take more than you're owed, the forest sends a toll collector, and that collector never forgets a debt. Three friends, Osri, May, and Kevin, were amateur paranormal investigators. They'd debunked more hauntings than they'd confirmed, approaching their hobby with a rational, tech-driven mindset. Their next target was a colonial-era bungalow at the peak of Bukit Larit near Taiping, reputedly haunted by the Penanggalan. The trek up the paved road was long, the cool air a welcome change from the lowlands. They reached the derelict bungalow just before dusk. It was a relic of British Malaya with peeling paint and shattered windows. The plan was to set up audio recorders and EMF readers until midnight, then hike back down. They found nothing. Hours passed in tedious silence. The EMF reader didn't spike. The audio recorders captured only the chirp of crickets and the distant call of a cicada. Disappointed, they packed up and began their descent around 11 p.m. The road was shrouded in a fog so thick it seemed solid. Their headlamps cut pale tunnels through the white, illuminating the gnarled roots and moss-covered stones lining the path. Kevin, leading the group, was the first to see it. 100 meters ahead, a figure stood in the middle of the road. It was a woman in a flowing white baju kurung, her back to them. Her long black hair hung past her waist, stark against the pale fabric. Kevin stopped, his bravado evaporating. "Okay, guys, that's just a hiker, probably lost." "At midnight?" May whispered, her voice trembling. "With no torch?" They stood frozen. Osri raised his camera, its infrared light piercing the fog. The figure was visible in the viewfinder, unnervingly still. Then it moved. It didn't walk, it glided, its lower body seemingly static as it shifted sideways off the road and into the dense, impenetrable jungle. They let out a collective breath they didn't know they were holding. "See? Probably just a local," Kevin said, his voice unconvincing. "Let's move, fast." They walked in a tight huddle, their pace quickening to a near jog. 10 minutes later, they saw it again. The same white figure, the same long black hair was standing in the middle of the road, 100 meters ahead, its back to them. A wave of primal terror washed over them. They hadn't passed any junction. The road was a straight line. There was no way it could have gotten ahead of them without them seeing it. "Don't run," Azri commanded, his rational mind grasping for control. "We walk. We don't give it the satisfaction." They kept walking, their eyes fixed on the figure. It didn't move, just stood there as they closed the distance. 50 meters, 30, 10. As they were about to pass it, its head began to turn. It wasn't a smooth motion. It was a jerky, unnatural swivel like a doll's head on a rusty spring. They saw a sliver of a pale, featureless face. It was then they realized it had been facing the jungle, but its feet were pointing towards them. It had been waiting for them to get close. Kevin broke. He screamed and ran. The spell shattered. They all bolted, slipping on the wet asphalt, their equipment clattering behind them. They didn't stop until they burst out of the fog into the clear air of the foot of the hill, gasping, covered in mud and leaves. They never went back for their gear. To this day, Azri refuses to look at the footage on his camera's memory card, which he keeps locked in a drawer, terrified of what it might have captured when they got too close.